The dual circulation doctrine means that every time the West imposes new trade restrictions, China has an incentive to redouble its self-sufficiency drive. The sanctions are not slowing the strategy. In several key areas, they are accelerating it. There is a dimension to China's trade strategy that is hiding in plain sight, not in secret documents or strategic programs, but in the most basic trade statistics. And it may be the most immediately disruptive element of all. China's trade surplus, the gap between what it exports and what it imports, hit a record in 2024 and continued surging into 2025. Not a marginal record, a historic one. China exported approximately $1 trillion more in goods than it imported, flooding every market on Earth with competitively priced manufactured goods. The continued surge of China's trade surplus in 2025 has reinforced what analysts are calling the China Shock 2.0 narrative, targeting China's industrial overcapacity. As China deepens its focus on strategic and frontier sectors, overcapacity in advanced manufacturing and green technologies will persist. The mechanism is straightforward. Chinese companies, subsidized by the state, build production capacity that far exceeds domestic demand. The excess production gets exported at prices that competitors elsewhere in the world structurally cannot match, not because Chinese workers are cheaper, but because Chinese companies are effectively subsidized by the Chinese state through cheap land, cheap capital, cheap energy, and direct cash grants. The result? European solar manufacturers, already struggling, were largely wiped out by Chinese pricing. European EV manufacturers are fighting for their lives against BYD and other Chinese brands entering their markets. Southeast Asian steel mills are closing because Chinese steel is cheaper. American manufacturers who survived the first China shock of the 2000s are facing the second one, now in higher value sectors. This is not accidental overcapacity. After establishing production capacity that far outstrips global demand and drives down domestic prices, China exports excess supply to undercut competitors and establish global dominance. This is already occurring in segments of the market. The pattern has been repeated in sector after sector: solar, steel, aluminum, shipbuilding, now EVs and batteries. Build domestic dominance through subsidy, then use scale to undercut global competitors, then establish a market position that persists even after the subsidies wind down. Physical goods are one dimension of China's global trade strategy. The other dimension is invisible, digital, and in some ways more consequential. The Digital Silk Road is the technological arm of Belt and Road, China's systematic effort to build the telecommunications infrastructure, digital payment systems, cloud computing platforms, and surveillance technology that developing countries need, binding them into Chinese digital ecosystems in the same way that Belt and Road physical infrastructure creates economic dependency. Huawei has built 4G and 5G networks across dozens of developing countries, often at prices that Western competitors cannot match, financed by Chinese state loans with technical support provided by Chinese engineers. In many parts of Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, Huawei built the Internet. The implications for data access, for cybersecurity, and for Chinese intelligence capabilities are the reason that the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, and others have spent years pressuring allies to exclude Huawei from their own networks. Chinese companies have laid a significant portion of the world's undersea fiber optic cables, the physical infrastructure through which most international internet traffic flows. In 2025, Chinese satellite internet constellations are advancing as direct competitors to Starlink, offering developing countries an alternative to Western-controlled satellite communications. Alibaba's cloud infrastructure serves as the backbone of digital commerce across much of Southeast Asia. Chinese digital payment systems, WeChat Pay, Alipay, have expanded across markets from Africa to the Middle East. Chinese facial recognition and smart city surveillance technology has been exported to over 80 countries. The digital infrastructure that a country uses is not neutral. It determines where data flows, who can access it, and who can cut it off in a crisis. China's Digital Silk Road is building a world in which a significant portion of the global digital economy runs on Chinese infrastructure that answers ultimately to Beijing. Since 2018, the United States has waged escalating economic warfare against China's trade strategy: tariffs, export controls, entity lists, investment restrictions. The Biden administration continued and expanded most of Trump's measures. The second Trump administration escalated further, pushing tariffs on Chinese goods to levels not seen in decades. And yet, here is the uncomfortable reality. China's trade position has, by most measures, strengthened rather than weakened. China sees an opening to turn President Trump's tariffs to its advantage in reshaping global trade in ways that would insulate its $19 trillion economy from U.S. pressure for the foreseeable future. China is accelerating trade deals and deepening global economic ties to counter U.S. tariffs and secure long-term dominance in global commerce. How? Through a combination of adaptation and redirection. Chinese manufacturers have rerouted exports through third countries, Vietnam, Mexico, Malaysia, to avoid American tariff labels. Chinese companies have built factories in Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe that produce goods technically outside China, while the supply chains and profits remain firmly in Chinese hands. More fundamentally, China has aggressively expanded its trade relationships with the global South, the countries that are growing fastest, that need the most infrastructure, and that have the least interest in joining Washington's economic containment efforts. In 2025, China signed free trade agreements and expanded economic partnerships with countries across Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. China's industrial policy will prioritize national interests over international commitments when necessary to pursue its development goals and respond to geopolitical challenges. The U.S.-China trade war has, in part, accelerated exactly the trend Washington most feared: the decoupling of the global economy into two spheres, one centered on the dollar and American alliances, and one centered on Chinese trade relationships and Chinese infrastructure. And in that decoupling, China is competing for the larger half, the developing world that contains the majority of humanity and the majority of future economic growth. China's plan to control global trade is real, it is working, and it is further advanced than most Western governments are comfortable admitting. But it is not complete, and the places where it is failing tell you exactly where the leverage points for a Western response actually lie. Despite massive investment, China remains reliant on foreign technology for advanced semiconductors and critical high-end components. Indigenous development of biopharmaceuticals and next-generation aircraft had lagged behind expectations. The semiconductor gap is the most important. China can make the chips that go in appliances, cars, and basic electronics, the so-called foundational or legacy chips. It cannot make the most advanced chips, the up-to-date processors made by TSMC and Samsung, using equipment manufactured almost exclusively by the Dutch company ASML that power AI systems, advanced weapons, and frontier computing. American export controls coordinated with Japan and the Netherlands to restrict sales of chip manufacturing equipment to China have genuinely slowed Chinese progress in this area. China had mixed progress towards its market share goals in semiconductors and the highly specialized equipment required to fabricate them, but it is rapidly increasing its share of global production capacity for foundational chips. The question is whether those controls can hold. ASML's ultraviolet lithography machines, which are necessary to make the most advanced chips, are arguably the single most strategically important manufactured objects in the world. As long as China cannot acquire or replicate them, it cannot reach semiconductor frontier. The race to either get those machines or build domestic equivalents is, alongside the AI race itself, the central technology competition of this decade. In commercial aviation, the Comac C-19 has entered domestic service, but has not broken into global markets dominated by Boeing and Airbus. In high-end biopharma, China remains dependent on Western firms for cutting-edge drugs. These are real gaps. They are also gaps that China is closing with extraordinary resources and strategic patience 1 year at a time. What does the world look like in 2035 if China's strategy continues at its current trajectory?